Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore, and friends, welcome back. I am doing things a bit differently this week. It's been a really busy season, as we'll discuss in just a few minutes, but I am recording today on Easter morning, Sunday the 5th, at a park. The weather is beautiful, and early this morning, my wife could sense something was up, and she's like, "What do you need?" And I said, "Like, more time and peace." And she said, "How about a walk in the park?" I said, "I don't have time for that, but I might go to a park and get some work done." And I'm so glad I did. So I hope wherever you are listening to this, you can open a window or look outside or take a few minutes to step outside. I think this whole week is supposed to be pretty nice. And I hope you find a little bit of peace. Touch grass, as the kids say. Well, I want to tell you that there has never been a more important moment, I think, to be paying attention to Oklahoma politics. And I don't say that in like a hyperbolic, cable news, everything's on fire kind of way. You know, that's not my style. I mean that in a really tangible, like this is what democracy actually looks like kind of way. And I say that as someone who's spent now 10 years doing this work and watching the machinery of our democracy up close. Sometimes, if I'm being honest, like with the kind of slow irritation or maybe like a slow building fury that I imagine is what keeps civics people young in some way. I get a lot of energy from this work. Now, before we get into it, I do want to say, make a quick plug for something that is keeping me very energized these days. And that's CivicsCon, right? CivicsCon's coming up this week, Thursday and Friday at Rose State College. We're doing this in partnership with them again, April 9th and 10th at Rose State. We hope to have some kind of community programming on the 11th. I'm just keeping an eye on the weather for right now. If you haven't already got tickets, you still have time. Go to civicscon.com. That's civics, that's plural. And do that. I get those tickets now. Sorry, if I sound a little distracted, it's because I'm at a park and there's people around talking to each other. This might not have been a good idea, but the birds are nice. Anyway, let's move on. So this conference is about civic engagement. It's about democracy. It's about what it looks like when real people show up and do the hard work. We have two great keynote speakers, as we mentioned last week. Joe Kennedy III will be our keynote on Thursday, and a former member of Congress from Massachusetts, someone who has a very unique perspective, I think, on democracy in America. And he's going to be talking about America at 250 years, right? This kind of reflection point in our history. Then on Friday, Dr. Alan Wiseman from Vanderbilt University, talking about the center, or about effective lawmaking, which I think is timely in many, many ways, both at the state and federal level. I promise you this is not a conference where people sit in folding chairs and just nod politely. Like, it really is designed to be a conversation. The breakout sessions are phenomenal. I was looking through the agenda earlier this morning, knowing that I, helped play a part in framing this conference or setting it all up. And still I was like, man, I'm really excited. There's a few panels that I'll be moderating, and invariably those are the times that I wish I could be just a participant or even in the other session. So please, you should come. It's really good. If you want to be a part of it, as I said, go to civicscon.com and get your tickets. They're just $50, and that does include lunch both days. Also on Thursday, there is a happy hour that's open to everybody, whether you can come to the conference or not. That happy hour will be at the new Skydance Brewing in Midwest City. So not the one in OKC that we normally have our democracy drinks happy hours at. This is their new location that just opened up last week. And that event is sponsored by our partners at Veterans for All Voters, which is a great nonpartisan organization helping veterans get plugged into kind of rebuilding our democracy. They're a great group. They co-hosted our happy hour last year at CivicsCon, and we're excited for them to be back this year. Now, on to this episode. We're going to talk at two things, two stories that I think when you put them side by side, they really paint a picture of democracy in Oklahoma that is, depending on your temperament, either deeply troubling or a very clear call to action. So in a few minutes, we're going to talk about candidate filing that happened this week. And the numbers tell us about whether voters are really getting a choice come November, or whether this whole thing is being decided somewhere else entirely. But first, we need to talk about what's happening at the legislature right now, because they've been busy and they're going to be done really soon. And so the question I want you to sit with is not just what they're doing, but who they are doing it for. So this week, you may have seen there was an article published in Oklahoma Watch. It's a piece by Paul Monies, and I want you to hear the headline. I'm going to read it out loud because sometimes the headline tells the story. The headline is, "Choose Your Own Voters. Republican lawmakers send high-stakes ballot initiatives to low turnout election." Choose your own voters. If you heard that phrase before, you might think about it in terms of gerrymandering. And indeed, Paul Monies, the journalist who wrote this piece, kind of tried to coin a few terms. A referenda, how did he phrase it? Referendum mandering or legimandering, trying to take a spin on gerrymandering, but in a different way. So this year, the legislature has passed a series of joint resolutions. Those are different than bills. They're similar but different. They, instead of going to the voter or instead of going to the governor for approval, they go to the voters, right? So this is essentially constitutional amendments. They touch on some of the most consequential policy decisions in the history of the state, I think, and rather than placing them as they would normally be on the November general election when most people show up to vote, and that's historically when Oklahomans have decided these kinds of big consequential questions, the legislature are routing these to the August 25th primary runoff election, which is one of the lowest turnout elections we have during the year. So August 25th, not November, August. This would be wild. Why does that matter? Well, because primary runoff elections are, as I said, like always very low. Turnout's usually between 10 and 12%. Abraham Lincoln said that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Of course, the people who wrote these joint resolutions are betting that the other 88 to 90% just stay home, in which case these decisions are left to just a very small minority of people. And I think it gets really more specific than that, because only voters who declared a party affiliation by March 31st, the end of last month, can participate in a partisan primary because we have closed primaries. So that means that the only people that will be paying attention to those August runoff elections are the super voters, the members of a political party who turn out for every election. And while I'm sure many of you listeners are those people, you're not like most people. I mean that in the best way. But there are, nearly 500,000 independent Oklahomans who do like to vote all the time, myself included. But as an independent who is prevented from voting in partisan primaries, I don't have a say in that. And so if I'm not paying close attention to other things on the ballot, it's pretty easy to get missed. Pat McFerrin, Republican pollster and kind of conservative, said in this Oklahoma Watch article that, quote, "there will be more Republicans and more conservatives voting in those elections," which is true. And this is not a partisan statement. It's just a fact of the matter. After looking at candidate filing, I don't anticipate that we will have any Democratic runoff elections on the primary runoff elections in November. So the only elections we expect to see on the ballot, only candidates, are a few Republican races, probably for governor. That's a big one. But down ballot, it's pretty rare for candidates to have more than two opponents, which is, you have to have at least three candidates running for a race in order for a runoff to even be possible. And then it still depends on what happens in the primary. So I don't think that's a warning. I think this is like a feature, right? The system we have with closed primaries necessarily means that a very small number of people have a chance to vote in these elections. And as I said, like only 10% usually show up. Well, that's a far cry from like the broadly representative democracy I think most of us expected that we live in. Now let's talk about what's actually going to be on that August ballot. And this is a preview that's not certain yet. at this point in the legislature, we're at the crossover point, right? Everything from the House that's passed the House is now over in the Senate. Things from the Senate that have passed are now over in the House. So they're halfway there, but they've still got, to get through this opposite chamber. So none of these are for sure yet. But the legislature has said this week, when they released their budget deal, that they are expecting to adjourn by the end of April, perhaps even sooner. I talked to a bunch of people this week who estimated it'll be between April 15th and May 1st, but that's the earliest they've adjourned in a long, long time. I know in 2018 they adjourned like 2 weeks early, like the middle of May, but this is like a long, long way off, which means anyone who's a capital day or has been watching bills and you think you've got until the end of May, like we normally do, that is not the case. So I think after this budget announcement this week, everyone realized, oh man, they're going to get done soon. That means we've got to really lock in and pay attention. Lock in, as my son says all the time. Lock in, Dad. Okay, so SJR, Senate Joint Resolution 47, would put a voter ID requirement in the Constitution. Now, we already have voter ID, as you know. If you vote, State Question 746, passed back in 2010, that basically put voter ID in statute, like regular laws. This one, SJR 47, would ask voters to put it in the Constitution itself. The argument for elevating it from statute to constitutional is that it makes the change harder for a future legislature to change, which would be true, but it's also worth asking, if this policy is already law, why the urgency? Why August? Why change our election system in the middle of a very consequential election year? Well, I think it's because voter ID, as one political consultant said this week, it's a huge issue for Republican voters specifically. It is a motivating issue, and it could be something that would increase turnout in the base, right, which is those voters they want to turn out. I don't think it's a coincidence that it lands on the same ballot as some of the other measures that we'll describe. House Bill 4440 would remove Medicaid expansion from the Constitution. It's not House Bill, it's House Joint Resolution. I think it's 4440. Would remove Medicaid expansion from the Oklahoma Constitution and reenact it into statute. So basically, if SJR 47 takes a law and puts it into the Constitution, this one takes it from the Constitution and puts it into the law, it downgrades it. And what that means is, basically we approved Medicaid expansion. We, the voters, approved Medicaid expansion in 2020 with an initiative petition without the legislature's help. It was State Question 802, and we put it into the Constitution on purpose because we knew that if it was just a statute, the legislature would try to undo it. So we built a lockbox to keep it out of the legislature's hands. And of course now lawmakers want voters to remove it from the lockbox in an election in August when most voters won't really understand what's happening. HJR 67 goes further. It would allow the state to simply stop covering Medicaid expansion if the federal government's matching rate drops below 90%. That's the way it works right now, and we'll talk more about this in future episodes, but essentially right now Medicaid is a 90-10 split between the feds and the state. And so if the feds lower their percentage, if they say we're only going to cover 85%, then that's a huge burden that shifts to the state. And this would basically make a trigger or a poison pill, and if that would basically stop covering that expansion. So if the Fed said, oh, we're only going to pay 89%, they just drop it 1% of coverage, then the state would just stop funding expansion entirely. And that means that, I think the number is close to 200,000 Oklahomans would lose their health insurance overnight. The flip side of this, right, is that the state could step up. We could find ways to shift revenue or increase revenue to help cover this. There's lots of things being discussed of how to move money around. We've got several $1 billion in our savings account. There's some options here. Also, this is a good deal for Oklahoma. I don't understand, what we should do is spend more time advocating the federal government. As a state, our state legislature should say, listen, feds, like, this is a good deal. We're a fairly unhealthy state. We're starting to make a little bit of progress. Please don't pull the rug out from underneath us. Anyway, another one is HJR 1076. And this one is, I think, worth noting for sheer like procedural audacity. It started its life as a one-paragraph shell bill with no substantive policy in it. It's just a placeholder, a blank page. And then 2 days before the deadline to cross over, there was a floor amendment, not in committee, on the floor, that changed it from a single page of no information to a 9-page proposed constitutional amendment that would restructure the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, or TSET. They've been calling this the TSET Reset, which is honestly really good branding. I kind of hate how good that branding is because it sounds benign. It doesn't sound dangerous. TSET manages something like $2 billion in public funds. This was funds that were created by a settlement when the state of Oklahoma sued the tobacco companies, Big Tobacco, and won. We're a bunch of states. We're one of the only states that set it up this way, which means we still have this corpus of a lot of money, and then the dividends from that pay out and go to specific projects every year. So this amendment would specifically eliminate TSET's independent board of directors and then redirect a portion of those earnings. Going back through history, though, Oklahomans have already voted twice on big November ballots to reject changes to TSET. And now lawmakers are going to try it again, but they're going to do it in August. I think that's an important thing. It's like they know that they've lost twice on the general election, and so now they're going to try it on a sneaky primary runoff ballot. I have my frustrations with TSET anyway, and in fact, I just saw this morning that the executive director that's been there for a long time is stepping down, I think probably under pressure from this or frustration with the legislature. And then we've got House Joint Resolution 1089. This is the Constitutional Convention bill. I think I've talked about this before, maybe last week, and I will link to it in the show notes. I know I mentioned it on This Week in Oklahoma Politics this week. It was also addressed on KGOU's Capitol Insider podcast last week, and it caught a lot of news last week, and that's because it didn't exist before that. So while most bills and measures are filed back in January, this one was filed by leadership on March 23rd, which was a Monday, in the middle of session on a deadline week. And then 2 days later, essentially, they passed it at 12:03 a.m., essentially on Thursday, I guess, the middle of the night between Wednesday and Thursday. And it passed almost on party lines, but not quite. There were some Republicans who crossed over. The bill didn't go through any committee. It went direct to the floor, passed the middle of the night, and it basically puts to the vote of the people a question: do you want to have a constitutional convention? And specifies that convention would be entirely comprised of the 149 members of the state legislature. No public members, no judges, no tribal representation, just the people who wrote this resolution deciding the outcome of the convention. Now, to be fair, our state constitution does say we should call for a convention every 20 years, and we've never done it for this very reason, right? That it was really hard to get done in the first place. It is unclear. We all know that the Constitution is a lengthy document it has lots of stuff that needs to be amended, which is why we have the initiative petition and why we often have 2 or 3 state questions every year kind of addressing some of these things. Although often the things we're addressing are brand new, like Medicaid expansion wasn't something we were amending from before. It was a new program. Those kinds of things. In some cases, we are trying to amend the Constitution to change stuff that's already in there, because that's how you have to do it. You can't change it with just a statute. Anyway, there have been efforts in the past, there have been previous state questions to call constitutional convention, and they all failed. Whether or not this one will fail, I'm not sure. And at the very least, and this is, members of the Freedom Caucus on the far right were saying, hey, shouldn't we have some members of the public, some other perspectives in the room. If we're going to rewrite the entire state constitution, we want to have diverse voices. That's not how we did it initially. And I hope we've learned something over the last 120 years. And also, to be fair, I want to be fair because I think fairness is a form of strength. The argument here that the legislature has always had the power to place measures on the ballot, and they're not wrong about that. Pat McFerrin in the same article made the point that Democrats, when they had power, used election timing to their advantage too. This is not a partisan tactic. It's a power tactic, right? Whoever's in power tries to do that too. And I will not pretend that the history of American politics is, a clean story of pure-hearted actors, though I wish it was. But I think here's what's different, right? FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, used to, some of you know, is like one of my favorite presidents, used to talk about what the American people could see with their own eyes. And I think what Oklahoma voters can see with their own eyes is that not since the right to work battles at the turn of the century has a legislatively sponsored state question appeared on a non-general election ballot in Oklahoma. This effort to refer these to an August ballot is not normal. It is a departure from what's normal. It's a departure made at exactly the moment when the legislature is trying to undo three separate things that voters themselves wanted. This isn't like new stuff, right? It's not like they want to allow ophthalmologists or optometrists to work at Walmart or whatever they tried a few years ago. It's not even about adding something. It's about undoing things that voters have already said we wanted. And the way they're doing it, passing bills in the middle of the night, referring it to a low turnout election, that seems sketcy AF. If maybe not sketchy, but it's not sketchy. It's very clear what they're doing, and it's infuriating, if I'm honest. And I'll say, because I said this to Paul Nunes at Oklahoma Watch for that article, and I'll say it here, I believe this is a coordinated strategy. When you take years to put a citizen-led initiative on the ballot, but you can ram a 9-page constitutional amendment through in just 2 days without a committee hearing, when you pick a date with 10% turnout and a filtered electorate, when you pair motivating base issues with rollbacks of voter-approved programs, you are not using the system. You are gaming the system. My quote to Paul in the article was that politicians for years have eroded the public's trust in systems through gerrymandering, closed primaries, and attacks on the initiative petition itself. They know they've got us on the ropes, and they're going to cram some stuff down our throats in an election that most people aren't paying attention to. And I said that because I mean it. I think that's exactly what they're doing. But to be clear, I also believe, and this is not optimism for its own sake, this is a conclusion I've reached based on the evidence, people are paying attention. You're listening to this podcast. How many other nerds are sitting around listening to podcasts about Oklahoma politics in the middle of the week? More than probably ever has in the past. More than lawmakers expect. My friend Amber England, who ran the 2020 Medicaid expansion campaign, said it plainly in this article as well. They're doing it because they believe that fewer voters means a better chance of controlling the outcome. But she said it because she believes, as I do, that we can change the denominator of this question, right? We can bring more people to the table. Just because it's a closed primary, just because it's August, and yes, all the independents and probably most or all Democrats won't really have a runoff election that they get to vote on in August. That doesn't mean they can't vote on these issues. This is a very important thing. Regardless of your party affiliation, you can vote on state questions, even if that's the only thing on the ballot. So in June, when minimum wage is on the ballot, everybody gets to vote, right? I don't get to vote for any candidates, but I can vote for that. In August, if any of these make it, I won't get to vote for any candidates, but I can vote for this. And so can you. All right. Enough about state questions, though, at least for now. Let's talk about the dynamics there, like the numbers, and let's talk about candidate filing. Normally, when we're recording, this is where I take a sip of a beverage for a bit of a transition. but I didn't bring any beverage with me to the park. So we go on. Okay, so this week was candidate filing. It was April 1st through 3rd. We saw a ton of people show up on April 1st, which is ironic because it's April Fool's Day. And in the past, often candidate filing has been like kind of mysterious. Like you don't know who's going to show up on what day. There's a lot of rumors and speculation about who's going to file and when and if they're going to. And I feel like there was less of that this year. In its place, though, was like a ton of energy. Like I was up there briefly on Wednesday, and it was like college game day. There was like a huge crowd. The media was all there, like set up like it's a big deal. Each party were like cheering on their candidates. There was like they had signs. It was all this photo opportunities. It was legitimately kind of exciting. It was like when college athletes are signing with a professional team, or people deciding which college to go to, or I don't know. Anyway, it was unexpectedly exciting. All told, there were 611 candidates who filed for office, and that certainly sounds like democracy might be humming along as it's supposed to. It's 600 people saying, "Hey, I want to serve. I'm going to take time off work. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to sacrifice a lot for myself and my family in order to do this because I believe that I'm the best person for this job, and I have to convince all of y'all that's the same thing." I applaud anybody who runs for office. It takes courage. It doesn't take as much courage just to put your name on it, but if you actually try, like campaign, that takes courage and hard work. So I don't want to take anything away from the people who filed. That's good stuff. But when you look at the data, and I mean really like look at it seat by seat, race by race, a different picture, I think, starts to emerge, one that connects directly to everything I just told you about the legislature, about gerrymandering, about closed primaries, and about filtered electorates, or like picking your own voters, right? Because the question's not really about how many people filed. The question is about how many of those races does a general election voter actually have a meaningful voice or choice. So here's the numbers, and I'm going to give you a bunch and then just hold on to them while we talk about it. So there were 321 positions on the ballot in Oklahoma this cycle. That's from U.S. Senate, the governor, all the way down to like associate district judges in every county. It's not municipal or school board. It's just county and statewide, and legislature and like congressional districts and all that. So when you sort that by whether the races, if you sort it by whether those races are determined in the general election or in a primary or a runoff, here's what you find. Of those 321 positions, 220 of those, which is like 69% of them, are decided already by default because only one person filed, or they will be decided in the primary. 69%. That's basically 7 in 10 races that are going to be on the ballot are already known. The outcome is already known, at least in terms of partisanship. And the judges are a little bit murky there, but let's go maybe like category by category. On the federal races, the U.S. Senate race for Markwayne Mullins' seat, and our 5 congressional districts, which are all on the ballot. These are probably the healthiest part of the picture. They're all somewhat competitive, partisan-ish, not super competitive, but on the ballot at least, they all have pretty strong cross-party races, which means all of those will end up on the ballot in November. U.S. Senate and all the congressional races will be on the ballot, so everyone gets to vote on some sort of congressional representation this year, because it means they have people from at least 2 parties, right? Republican, Democrat, and or Libertarian, and Independent. There's a bunch of independents who filed as well. The other statewide races, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, state treasurer, labor commissioner, insurance commissioner, and a corporation commissioner, and state superintendent of public instruction. 8 of those 9 have genuine, like, general election competition. The state auditor and inspector is running unopposed, so just one candidate, so that's kind of your choice. I guess that means that person is already done. There are 127 legislative seats that are going to be on the ballot. every seat in the House is up for election this year. That's 101 plus half of the Senate and maybe a couple of extra that are vacant. So 127 altogether. 54 are already decided because that's like, so 54 seats out of all of that is 43%. Those are decided before any ballots are cast because they were unopposed. All of the Senate Democrats were unopposed. A bunch of the House Democrats were unopposed. As I said, this is not necessarily a partisan issue. This is a power issue or a democracy issue. Both my state House and my state senators, who happen to be both Democrats, were unopposed, so they're already elected. And that means that even their supporters don't get to vote for them. I've talked to a few of my neighbors who really like their state rep and were like genuinely disappointed they don't get to vote for her. I think that's important too. I mean, from the candidate side, whew, what a relief. You don't have to campaign. You can go help out your colleagues or focus on other things. But from a democracy standpoint, a representation standpoint, I think it often we lose some enthusiasm there when this kind of thing happens. 33 seats were simply totally unopposed. One candidate, no competition. Oh, and then 54 of those weren't all unopposed. 33 were unopposed and automatically reelected. 19 more were Republican incumbents. No, 19 of those are Republican incumbents in very deep red districts. They're solid. 14 are Democratic incumbents in safe blue seats. So no primary, no general, they just go. Then there's 21 races where there is some competition, but only within one party. So 17 of those are all Republican primaries, 4 are all Democrat primaries, and then the winner of the primary of each of those is going to go on to the legislature, so really no meaningful general election. So in 43% of state legislative races, the voters who actually determine the outcome are not November voters. They're primary voters in June and maybe in August. In many cases, they're a slice of the primary who show up in closed, low turnout contests in heavily gerrymandered districts or very safe districts. And so this is where I think these two stories, right, the joint resolution story and the candidate filing story kind of snap together. The legislature is looking at sending measures to the ballot that would undo Medicaid expansion, they would undo TSET, they would codify voter ID in the Constitution and call a constitutional convention. All of that, they're looking at sending that to an August ballot with turnout at 10%. And then the legislature was not put there by the broad will of the Oklahoma electorate. It was put there by this very narrow slice of the electorate. It's a system that was designed to produce exactly that kind of result, right? District attorneys, there's 27 DA races, which is all of them, and all of them will be decided either by default or in a Republican primary. None of them are genuinely competitive in November, not any of them. That's kind of been the case for DA races. It might be, I think, competitive in the primary, but not in the general. Like I think Vicky Bahena, who's the OKC DA, won. I don't think she was unopposed, so I think she already won. In Tulsa, I know there's a race. Colleen McCarty is running against the incumbent, whose name escapes me right now. I'm sorry. So there'll be a competitive race there, but in the primary. Judicial races are always a bit of a weird deal. There's 152 positions on the ballot for district judges and associate district judges across the state. 138 of those, which is like 91%, have only one candidate. So that's, like a done deal. We're supposed to be electing the judiciary, but that's not really how it works. As voters know, it's often hard to find information out about the judiciary as well. And so even when they are on the ballot, it's like hard to know much about them. That's tricky. So I think I want to be careful here because there are real arguments for why judicial elections work differently. And there's real arguments that competitive judicial elections cause, I think, their own problems. I take those arguments seriously. But the point is that not every race needs to be competitive. The point is that when you step back and look at like the whole picture, you, from the legislature to the DAs to the courthouse, like you see a system where the concept of voter choice has been really hollowed out. Former President Bill Clinton once said that there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what is right with America. I want to believe that's true, but I think fixing it requires being honest about what is broken. And what's broken is like a system where map drawers choose voters before voters ever choose representatives. That's gerrymandering. Where primaries are closed and runoffs are basically engineered. Where a constitutional convention can pass the House at midnight without any committee hearings, and a minimum wage initiative that takes 2 years to certify and appear on the ballot, where 68% of the offices on your ballot are already decided by the time you show up in November. I'm not trying to bum you out, but the numbers are what the numbers are, and I just think we all need to be clear-eyed about where democracy sits, because then we can talk about how to fix it. President Kennedy, JFK, talked about the obligation, not the option, but the obligation of citizens to participate in the great decisions of their time. The great decision of our time here in Oklahoma is not just who to vote for, it's whether the system itself gives your vote meaning. And the answer to that question depends entirely on whether enough of us are paying attention, showing up, refusing to accept a diminished version of democracy as acceptable. I think that's not the natural order of things. 611 people filed to run for office this week. That's tremendous. That is democracy trying to work. In the words of President Clinton, that's like the thing that's right with our country. The question now is whether the architecture around it is going to let democracy actually succeed. I think that's the question that I'm like wrestling with the most this week here in this park, with the chittering of the squirrels in the background. And I hope you sit with that too. Does the architecture of our democracy actually work? Does it let democracy succeed? And if not, how can we fix it to make it better? All right, well, that's the end of our show for this week. If this conversation matters to you, please share it. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe. If you haven't left a review in a while or never have, please do. If you're new listeners, please go leave us a review in the on Spotify or Apple or wherever you consume your podcasts. Do all the things you're supposed to do to help, independent shows like us reach more people. And don't forget, come to CivicsCon. This coming Thursday, Friday, April 9th and 10th, at Rose State College in Midwest City. CivicsCon.com is the website to get your tickets. We built it because we believe these conversations deserve a bigger room. As we say every week, decisions are made by those who show up. I'll see you at CivicsCon.